Hello and welcome to another session of Speak to Save, Save being Spiritual Abuse and Violence Eradication Project. I'm your host, Mariam Mahmood, and today we have yet again another wonderful guest with us. Today's guest I'm going to introduce now is Tay Jiva MBE, who is a prominent Muslim social worker in the UK. Tay has worked with vulnerable children and families for over 20 years now and has 2 degrees in psychology, a master's in forensic psychology, and a master's in social work. She's been awarded an MBE for her work promoting adoption and fostering within Muslim communities. Tay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Mariam. Really appreciate it.
So let's crack on, just get right in there. Today, of course, as you know, we're discussing, yet again, spiritual abuse. If you could enlighten our listeners in your own words, based on, the invaluable experience that you have working at the very forefronts of grassroots movements and activism in British Muslim communities, what is meant by spiritual abuse?
So from my experience, and I speak very much as a social worker and as a Muslim who has lots of communication with other people in the community, but first and foremost as a social worker, I would say there is a spectrum of behavior within faith communities which could be considered to be abusive. So for example, people who are not Muslim, perhaps atheist, I've heard some of them say that actually just teaching someone religion, they consider to be abusive. And actually, for myself, as someone who's very strong in my faith as Muslim, me teaching my children the faith is absolutely not abusive because I teach them really strong values of compassion and love and resilience and, the values that would make them good members of society and they contribute. However, I do acknowledge there are some people who teach their children values which are quite hostile values. And, I think the majority of Muslims would agree that that is not in the spirit of Islam to be teaching children in an aggressive way. And what can happen when it becomes abusive is that parents and older people in the community, or not necessarily even older, people with social power in the community can teach other people that, for one, to be Muslim means that the people who are practicing the religion may be aggressive in nature, and that's part of the faith. Some people teach in that way, but also sometimes parents and people with social power might manipulate the faith, manipulate people's unquestioning trust to abuse people. And it might be parents abusing children, and it could be people with social power abusing people who we could say are vulnerable within society, but vulnerable again is a very loose term. It could be someone with social power who is manipulating people who you wouldn't think are vulnerable. But actually, because they've put such unquestioning trust in someone with social power, they are vulnerable to being manipulated. And the level of abuse varies. From my experience, I've worked with some children who've been really horrifically abused in different ways. And I've worked with adults as well, who, for example, children who've been physically, even sexually abused by family members or faith leaders, worked with women who've also, for example, I've worked with one mum who I worked very closely with, who suffered years and years of really high levels of abuse and isolation. And she thought that this was part of her faith for her to be subject to this level of abuse. And it was her and her children.
Thank you so much for elaborating on this. This so many words that you mentioned: social power, this abuse of trust, and people unquestioningly they've given their trust over. Basically, there's so it seems like there are levels and layers of this abuse. So you mentioned a few examples as well. I was going to say, how does it manifest? But you've enlightened us a little bit. So in your experience working with children in Muslim communities, do you think spiritual abuse is growing? Do you think it features as one of the biggest challenges that are emerging? And kind of, How do you deal with it in your capacity as a senior social worker?
So, in terms of whether it's growing or not, I think it's impossible to really say where we're at with that. What I would say is that I feel that whereas in previous generations, where whenever somebody was abused, the likelihood of them disclosing that abuse is very, very small. And also, when they do disclose that abuse, then it's not managed in the way that it should be managed. So, for example, numerous cases of people who are now adults disclosing abuse by faith leaders that happened to them when they were younger. However, they were advised by family and strongly, I want to say advised, they were told in no uncertain terms that you can't disclose this information, which meant that those faith leaders could then continue to abuse other people. And then as adults, this only comes out in the open when that faith leader has died. Therefore, the abused person now feels that they feel safe enough to disclose what has happened to them. And even then, it's not done in a very open way. It's only done with a select few people. So I think in terms of moving forward, there will be work like the work that you're proposing, little bits of the work that I'm doing, where we normalize people being able to say, I was abused by my faith leader, and more people will respond by saying, that's really sad. I'm really sorry to hear that. What can we do about this now? Whereas what used to happen and what can still happen is a lot of people reacting with, well, that can't have happened. And there's that gaslighting and denial of what has happened. And what I found from experience is that when there's people who haven't been through abuse or trauma, they find it very difficult to accept and understand and respect when someone else says, actually, I suffered abuse and trauma, whether it's from parents or whether it's from faith leaders. People who haven't suffered that don't want to hear that. So they will work out all sorts of ways and they'll do all sorts of mental gymnastics for their worldview to not change. And their worldview is parents are not abusive, faith leaders are not abusive. So if you're telling me you were abused, then let me figure out how I can fit that into my worldview. So I think as generations go on, we will see more disclosures, but that doesn't mean that there was more or less now.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. So my next question is about the ways in which we can make spaces and communities safer, not just safeguarding. So we can talk about the parameters of safeguarding in terms of the sort of the policies that we can implement in organizations, but how do we get to a stage where it is okay for people, or they feel okay to speak out and speak up about the abuse that they had suffered without fearing this gaslighting, or as you said, waiting until the perpetrator has passed away in order to share your story and share your truth? What can we do as, firstly, as people who work in this field? What can be done?
Well, first and foremost, I think some of the work that you're proposing to do with Muslim community groups in terms of highlighting and the work that we're doing now is the message that we're sending to victims of abuse is we hear you, we respect you, we know it's happening, you're not alone. There's lots of other people this has happened to, and lots of people have not talked to anyone about it. It's happened to them when they were children, and a lot of people are adults now, and they've still not disclosed it. So for those people who haven't disclosed it, it's really important that they hear they're not alone. There's lots of other people it's happened to. What we'll find often with victims of abuse is that they don't want to disclose it themselves, but when they see other people have disclosed it, their feelings towards it is different because they will want to protect the other people. They will want the other people to disclose so they can seek help and they can seek support. So often with victims of abuse, they want to protect other people, they want to empower other people. But when it comes to themselves and what they want for themselves, it's like they suffer in silence. They don't give themselves the same love and affection and care, and they don't boost themselves the same way they want to see other people boosted. So the more people that disclose, the more open we are about this, the more accepting we are about this, the more likely people are to start being open and to start discussing. That said, when you mentioned about, the gaslighting and the denial. And we're not at the stage yet where that doesn't happen. And the sad truth is, for anyone who wishes to disclose publicly, they will face that. They will face a fairly reasonable amount of hostility from maybe from family, maybe from friends, maybe from the public. Mm-hmm. So for victims who do disclose, it could be done just with the police, or it could be done potentially if there are any organizations who are willing to listen to them, who are specialists in this field. It could be managed by them. Never go to anybody who's not a specialist in this field. I would say to anyone who's a victim of abuse, do not walk in to a mosque or a community center or an organization where somebody has not got extensive training and extensive experience of working with victims of abuse, because they are likely to not deal with that in a way that's best for you. So yeah, I think that sadly, though, the gaslighting is always going to be there. So victims do have to be careful about who they disclose what to. But for anyone who wishes to disclose publicly and feels ready to deal with the denial, deal with the hostility, they are doing a great service to other victims of abuse who will see. And, me, myself, I think you may or may not be aware, there's a certain amount of hostility that I face, particularly on social media, not in my real life, thankfully, but particularly on social media. People see that there is a lot of abuse. And it's just, it's things that are said. I've had phone calls of people making threats. I hope that other people can see that it doesn't deter me from doing what I'm doing, and it doesn't affect me, and they've not changed my life. Other people's opinions and views haven't changed my life. Now, I haven't disclosed significant abuse, so I haven't done what I am. I'm not inviting other people to do it, but I'm respecting those people who do choose to disclose publicly. They will face a lot of hostility, and it's really important that people like you and I are able to be supportive of those people, and they should know that there are people there who will protect you, but there will be other people who attack you.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And of course, you mentioned that you were attacked or threatened. I empathize with you wholeheartedly, and I'm sure many people listening will also, it'll resonate with them as well. So this is great. You mentioned the work that both of us are doing, other organizations are doing. And I think, when it comes to mosques or community centers, you mentioned quite, you asserted quite well that anyone who is a survivor shouldn't take their grievances or their issues to people in those sectors who are not fully trained. So my question now is regarding these communities and these social groups. What can be done to encourage them or to aid them or facilitate their endeavors in implementing better safeguarding policies? So of course, for some of the listeners, and of course for yourself, I should say that, I've been working in a capacity where I train faith leaders in my day job at the University of Birmingham with regards to social challenges. But I think so much more needs to be done that is specific to communities of faith that are, you can't have a broad brush and say this is what all faith communities should be doing. Minority faith communities, specifically in this case, Muslim communities. What can and should be done besides, this overarching, I wouldn't call it policy or this move, but what tangible change can be implemented?
There's a few things that I think have happened or started to happen which are making some change. I should start by saying that from my experience, knowledge of safeguarding in Muslim community groups, including charities, mosques, community centers, is dire, is so poor. And this is from me working with various organizations regarding their safeguarding. And that to me as a social worker is very, very concerning, because when people don't have an understanding of safeguarding, when I say people, I mean organizations who have responsibility over other people, when they're not aware of their safeguarding duties, and say they don't have safeguarding knowledge, what's going to happen is people will be abused and people will be targeted. So, for example, one of the biggest concerns for me, and one of the weakest areas of our practice is international charity work. Because for any abuser, for example, a pedophile, who wishes to have access to the most vulnerable children in the world, then it's quite easy actually for them to join a charity, whether it's, for Muslims, I would say a Muslim charity, but I'm sure it's the same for other faith groups and no faith groups. But there are a lot of Muslim charities, and I'll speak from my experience of working in the Muslim sector. There's a lot of Muslim charities where people in the community can join that charity. They can offer to raise a certain amount of money, and it's actually not that difficult for them to say, well, I'm going to raise X amount of money, send me to Syria, send me to Gambia, send me to wherever, and I will go and distribute the money and I will join the charity work. But where are the safeguarding procedures and policies there? Where's the training? Where's the supervision? Where's the checks? How does that charity confidently know that these people who are fundraising for them and, who wish to go out and do this charity work are not there to abuse children? How do we really, really know that? So I would say, that I think the easy solution would be that people in the community don't donate to charities who don't have strict safeguarding in place. However, I think given that the charities themselves don't know what's required of safeguarding, I think to ask the public to have any understanding or knowledge of that is asking too much. I believe there needs to be more strategic work. An organization that looks at these issues will highlight where there are safeguarding gaps. So people in the public can go to this organization and say, should I donate to this charity? Should I send my children to this mosque? Should I attend this community center? And where Muslims take responsibility within our own area of work. Some people would say, oh, well, the charities are registered with the Charities Commission. The Charity Commission's threshold is very, very low. Hence, there's volunteers going abroad. And I'm not saying they are abusing children. I'm saying I would say that it's quite likely to be going on because it's easy access for abusers.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And you're quite right, actually. That is definitely a huge issue. We've had cases in the recent past, in the last year or so, with specifically these issues pertaining to the Muslim community. So any of our listeners who are familiar with that, I'm sure what we're saying now makes an awful lot of sense. So working towards, safeguarding and having these checks and balances is absolutely imperative. So I completely agree with you. And yes, I think one thing that you said, if these charities don't know what these safeguarding procedures are, what can we expect from ordinary members of the public? So I think that's probably going to be my next question then, given all that we've spoken about. Say if there are people who are listening today and they feel strongly about all that we've spoken about, and they wish to make a difference. What sort of advice can you give to ordinary members of the public? Whether they're Muslim or not doesn't really matter. But if you wish to give specific advice to those who are part of our British Muslim community, what would you say to them? How can they make a difference?
As you know, and as you said already, I am an experienced professional social worker. I have particular skills and knowledge, which I'm trying to utilize to my best efforts to raise Muslim community groups, to safeguard people in Muslim community groups. I've also set up the Muslim Social Workers Association quite recently. I think it's really important that other Muslim social workers come together and we tackle this issue because we are the experts when it comes to safeguarding. And I think this is a cultural change that needs to happen in Muslim communities where we don't expect imams and sheikhs and religious leaders, we don't expect them to be the experts in everything. There's too many people who, if I said one thing about safeguarding and imam said something about safeguarding who has no training or expertise in safeguarding, there's too many Muslims who would think, well, that's the imam though, so they understand the religious perspective of safeguarding. And that is a false understanding. Safeguarding is safeguarding. and I am the expert in that. I would say for people in the public who wish to improve Muslim society, they should ask themselves, well, what do I bring to the table? Because we can't expect everyone to know everything and do everything, even our imams and sheikhs and scholars. We can't expect them to know everything, but we should bring something to the table and say, this is what I can do. And if there isn't anything you can identify, then have a think about, well, what is it that you want to bring to the table? And then whatever it is you want to bring to the table, educate yourself, get experience in that sector, and then come and elicit change. Goodwill is fantastic, but it's not enough to make real, strong, good progress. So I would say that for the professionals, for people who are experienced, even for like stay-at-home moms, right? So some people might think, well, they're not professionals, but actually their expertise is the care of the children or the care of the home. We need to hear them because what they do is such a valuable contribution to our community. We need to give them a seat at the table as well. We need to hear everyone's voices. So I can come in as a social worker, but also I'm a mom, also I'm a wife. So I can come in and bring a little bit, but really the social work aspect is my thing. And, Miriam, you have your thing that you bring to the table. People should respect your knowledge that you bring, not let your gender, not let the fact that you're not head covering, as neither am I, that's irrelevant because you come with such a vast amount of experience and knowledge. We should utilize that. So I think it's that strategic coordination of knowledge that really would boost our community so well. But people need to come forward and do that.
Thank you, Tay, for saying that. I really appreciate all that you've said, but particularly that not all of us have to do the same thing or attack this or issue from the same angle, or say, we're all going to work on safeguarding. Well, actually, that's one element of it, and leave it to the experts. Thank you also for raising the issue that we often encounter as Muslim women, that our gender unfortunately often results in people undermining our authority. So we hope and we pray that people can overcome this and take us for who we are and not stigmatize us just because we're women who don't happen to wear a headscarf. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights, Tay. This has been absolutely wonderful, really fruitful conversation, and I hope the first of many, many more. Just before we depart, if there's any words of advice, besides all the wonderful advice you've already given, or absolutely anything that you would like to share before we close.
I think, honestly, I think people should follow the work that you're doing because I've read more about what you're doing and I can see such huge potential in the projects that you're looking to undertake. So, for you to develop your work in this sector, as I've said, you are knowledgeable in this work, you are an expert in this work. So for people, I want to ask for something realistic and something that's achievable for everybody in the community. Just keep an eye on the work that you're doing. Know the intention behind the work that you're doing, which is to improve Muslim community groups, and where they can support that, because what you're trying to do is keep people safe, not just children, but adults as well. And what an important thing that is for Muslim communities, that there is work done to make sure that abuse isn't happening in the name of our faith. That is such a huge and important topic that people should look to you and say, well, what do you want us to do? And follow the conversations and the discussion and the slow progress, because this isn't going to be an overnight thing. People have to be patient and try and support you in this and give it time, and all make dua and pray for it to happen. And where we can support in any other way, support you in that work.
Thank you so much for such kind and encouraging words, and of course for your contribution to this vital conversation. And I just want to add that thank you for supporting and for reaching out like this and saying that people ought to learn more from one another. I just want to add that it takes a whole village to do this.
Absolutely.
And I feel so inspired by the work that you are doing, and to other people who are also established leaders in our community. And I hope and I pray that we can all work together towards this cause of eradicating spiritual abuse, the weaponization
Amen.
of our very faith. And so, inshallah, let's keep this going for now. I think we shall call it a day. Thank you so much, Tay.
Thank you so much, Mariam.